In simplest terms, the study of history is the study of the past. It would seem rather straightforward, but one problem with studying the past is that, well, it's in the past. We can no longer look at it from a first-hand perspective like a scientist might observe the events in an experiment he or she is conducting. Nor can we recreate events exactly as they occurred. What we are left with to study is only memory and records. Further complicating the matter is that we can only view this past through the lens of our own perspective and viewpoint. The historian is never simply a neutral observer, but he has his own bias, colored by his own experiences. In the following slides we'll examine the study of history and the tools of the historian. In British author George Orwell's dystopian world of his novel 1984, history is continually recreated to suit the political needs of Big Brother, the all-powerful political party that controls Oceania. At the beginning of the novel, for example, Oceania is at war with Eurasia and allied with East Asia. Then alliances change and Oceania finds itself at war with East Asia and allied with Eurasia. The main character in the story, Winston Smith, has the job at the government's Ministry of Truth, of doctoring history, so that it appears as though Oceania has always been at war with East Asia and allied with Eurasia, and not the other way around. History is always malleable and ever-changing to suit the needs of Big Brother, the government. The past is whatever the party, the government, says it is. One has to wonder whether Orwell was thinking of his own country's alliance with the Soviet Union against Germany during the Second World War, and the quick reversal following the war, where England and the United States later found themselves allied with Germany, or West Germany anyhow, against the Soviet Union in the Cold War. It was the same earlier with the Japanese allied with England and the United States in the First World War, but then suddenly enemies during the Second World War. Big Brother never explains the shift. He merely expects people to redirect their hatred and prejudice to their new enemy and embrace their former enemy as a new friend. Better yet, forget that they were ever enemies or friends in some earlier time. It is a disconcerting thought, but the past can be altered. Not the actual events, of course, but our memories and perceptions of the events. For example, examine the two photos above. Notice the differences between the two. The one on the left is the original, showing various leaders of the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. Following the death of the revolution's leader, Lenin, the man in the center wearing the fur hat, a power struggle occurred between Joseph Stalin, who's not in the picture, and Leon Trotsky, who is standing to Lenin's right in the picture. Stalin emerged victorious in this struggle, and Trotsky and those allied with him were kicked out of the party. Trotsky and most of his followers were not only ousted from the party, many of them, along with Trotsky, later murdered, but the Soviet government of Stalin also made every effort to all but erase Trotsky and other party members allied with him from Soviet history. No pictures showing Lenin and Trotsky as comrades or stories of Trotsky being anything but a traitor to the revolution were permitted. Notice how Trotsky and some of his allies have been removed from later versions of the very same photo on the right. Lenin was regarded as a hero of the revolution, and Stalin was determined that future generations must not know how close Lenin and Trotsky actually were. Only Stalin's version of history must survive. Historians rarely falsify evidence as was done in Stalin's Russia, with altered photographs and documents. When one suspects such things, however, the historian needs to seek additional sources or find copies of the original document. This can be a very laborious task involving travel to distant places and digging through file cabinets that may or may not contain what you are looking for. The original may have been destroyed or be inaccessible because it is classified top secret by a government determined to conceal the truth. Historians often can interview people who had direct knowledge of the document or event, but memories are sometimes unreliable, or witnesses may have reasons for being less than totally truthful. We are often left with a mystery, with multiple possibilities or even probabilities, but no definitive proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Examine the quote here. You might not be surprised to find that the author of the above quotation was Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln is perhaps the most quoted of American political leaders. He was regarded by most American historians as our greatest president, and the man who freed the slaves. His anti-slavery sentiments are well known and constantly touted by historians. Now let's look at this quote. What are we to make of this quotation? Is it Jefferson Davis, the President of the Confederacy? No, it's the very same Abraham Lincoln quoted on the previous slide. History is much about what is not revealed and discussed as to what is. Lincoln scholars rarely include quotations like the one above in their work because they typically want to show Lincoln in a very favorable light. This quote suggests Lincoln, though opposed to slavery, was a thoroughgoing racist. Most Lincoln scholars rarely talk about this side of Lincoln's character. What has evolved is a kind of cult of personality surrounding Lincoln, just as had occurred among the Soviet historians when discussing Stalin. During his life and for a few years after his death, Stalin was portrayed in Soviet history books as a heroic figure who saved the Soviet Union from its enemies both inside and out. Stalin could do no wrong. He was the perfect man. It was not until Nikita Khrushchev denounced Stalin 3 years after his death in 1956 that anyone dared mention the millions of people murdered by Stalin's NKVD security police, or Stalin's direct responsibility for the deadly famines in the Ukraine, or the woeful unpreparedness of the Soviet military because of Stalin's purges of the Soviet officer corps prior to Hitler's invasion in 1941. Lincoln has been dead for nearly 150 years, but yet the Lincoln cult survives to this day. Why is that? Khrushchev had good reason for denouncing the great Stalin in 1956 and putting an end to Stalin's cult of personality. Khrushchev was attempting to secure his own hold on political power, and he needed to purge the Soviet Communist Party of Stalin loyalists. One might ask what purpose or whose purpose is served by perpetuating the Lincoln cult. What would be the political consequences of bringing Lincoln's actions and personality into question? If Lincoln was ever wrong, does that mean his opponents may have been right? Was the Civil War that Lincoln started really necessary? If not, what does that say about the entire centralized political order that emerged from the war? As George Orwell well understood, how we understand and interpret the past has profound implications for how we understand and interpret the present. Which brings us to the issue of secondary sources. The photos and quotations above are considered primary sources, in that they came from the time and place actually being studied. The historian uses primary sources to investigate history. What remains is to put these sources into context and reach conclusions about them. Secondary sources must be approached with caution, and that often the author's bias creeps into the account or into the selection and interpretation of evidence. Books or essays written in the heat of current events are often biased and based on incomplete information. Historians are people too, and just as likely to get caught up in events and passions of the time as anyone else. The careful reader will look over an author's footnotes. Where is the material coming from? What does the primary source say? Is it consistent with what the author is saying about it? This is very difficult work, often requiring the reader to have extensive knowledge of the events. When possible, readers should find secondary sources from a different perspective and read critical reviews of the secondary sources he or she is reading. Scholarly reviewers will often have the necessary background to point out flaws that less well-informed readers may miss. Secondary sources can also be primary sources, since they often tell us much about the time the book was written as about the time the historian was writing about. Too often history becomes little more than political propaganda. Each nation's government promotes its own version of the nation's glorious past. National histories are used by political leaders both as a means of glorifying themselves and as a means of promoting hatred and fear of others. Wars are often justified by assigning blame to the enemy, with one's own nation always cast in the role of innocent victim fighting only to defend itself, even when this defense involves troops marching on some other nation's soil. When the events of 9/11/2001 unfolded, many people reacted with fear and jumped to the conclusion based on information fed to them by the media and the government. Those who knew their history said, "Wait, we've seen this movie before." They remember how people have been lied to and manipulated before under similar circumstances, like the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, or the Tonkin Gulf incident in 1964. Never heard the story behind 1941 or 64? Perhaps you should. It took many years of historical research to get at the truth of these events, and even after many decades, we still likely don't know the whole story. Perhaps just as important as the study of history is the study of history. The history of history is called historiography. At any given time, professional historians are likely to view events differently than they had before or afterward. Sometimes these differences are the result of new information being discovered or gaining access to previously classified, that is, secret government documents. Other times it has to do with the political environment the historian is writing in. Historians, like anyone else, are often reluctant to write histories that portray their own country unfavorably, or that reveal uncomfortable facts that might not be accepted by other historians or by the general public, no matter how strong the evidence. The work of the late American historian Harry Elmer Barnes provides a good example. Shortly after the First World War, very young Barnes wrote that it was Germany which bore primary responsibility for causing the war. Other American and British historians echoed Barnes. Later, Barnes reversed his position, arguing that it was in fact Russia and France that bore most responsibility. Today, most historians argue that both sides bore some responsibility for causing the war. Barnes' position during the war was understandable. Much important evidence was secret and not available while the war was still going on, and kept secret for many years thereafter. Much of what Barnes had to work with was from the Allied side and was heavily biased in finding fault with the enemy. In addition, anti-German passions were high in the US and Britain, and a book that was in any way favorable to the German side would not have been well received. This is not to impugn Barnes' intellectual integrity, but to show the constraints historians must work under. Only after passions have cooled and new evidence has become available did more balanced works begin to appear about the war. It took even longer for the ideas of these works to find their way into typical high school history texts. Barnes was a man of his time and likely subject to the same passions as his fellow countrymen in time of war. Barnes, in fact, took great professional risks during the 1920s by revising his earlier position and repudiating his earlier work. Barnes and other so-called revisionist historians like Charles Beard and more recently Howard Zinn became noteworthy for their willingness to challenge long-held views on American history. Each historian has been attacked for their views in published writings, with some critics finding their work un-American, but the contributions of the revisionists have stirred much-needed debate and contributed to entirely new lines of inquiry previously not considered. One of the most controversial historians in history was Karl Marx. Marx developed a theory of history based on what he called class struggle. Marx believed that all of human history can be understood as a series of conflicts between those who controlled productive economic resources and those who did not. In agricultural societies, for example, the controlling class would be the landowners. In more modern industrial societies, it would be the factory owners. The peasant farmers or the industrial working class would be systematically exploited and impoverished by the exploiting owners, who would amass great wealth at the expense of the workers. This wealth would not only buy luxury and a life of ease, but the exploiting class would also amass great political power. The state or government would serve to protect the property and privileges of the exploiting class. Marx contended that this exploitation would eventually lead to revolution. The more numerous exploited class would rise up in a violent revolution and destroy the owning class and its government. And then a new state would emerge, and a new exploiting class would emerge, and the cycle would repeat itself. Marx argued that the modern industrial state he saw developing around him in the mid-19th century would lead to the final stage of man's history. Here the industrial workers, what Marx called the proletariat, would overthrow the industrial entrepreneurs, or what Marx called the bourgeoisie. The workers' state, or dictatorship of the proletariat, would then transform society by abolishing all property and classes, and history as we know it would come to an end. Man would then live in perfect peace and harmony in a condition Marx called communism. While very few historians buy into Marx's utopian, or rather dystopian, vision of man's future, many implicitly or explicitly accept Marx's framework for historical analysis. They see history as driven primarily by economic forces, rather than by individual people making decisions, and they see economic class as of prime importance in understanding the distribution of power. Many of the revisionist historians, like Howard Zinn, view history through the lens of Marx's class struggle. Then there are the so-called conspiracy theories. Establishment historians often ridicule those who write or speak of grand conspiracies or secret plots and secretive people who steer events from behind the scenes. True, many of these theories or plots are quite outlandish and improbable, if not impossible. Hitler's anti-Semitic government, for example, promoted a version of history built around a vast conspiracy theory of Jews around the world out to impoverish and destroy Germany. No proof of any such conspiracy or group of organized Jews bent on taking over the world was ever produced, but the alleged existence of such a conspiracy gave Hitler and his Nazi party a convenient scapegoat to blame all of Germany's problems, past and present, on. In similar fashion, today's American neoconservatives promote the idea of a vast Islamic conspiracy to destroy Americans through terrorism. But again, no proof of any such plot exists. Alleged terrorist plots that have been exposed have been almost entirely cases of FBI entrapment of deranged loners, or small groups of keyboard commandos spouting off of their hatred on their blogs. Had the FBI not encouraged and supplied these individuals or small groups with weapons and explosives, they likely never would have tried to carry out any attacks. As for the terror attack of 9/11, 2003, or 2001, the official government story is that a highly organized group of Islamic extremists calling themselves Al-Qaeda carried out the attacks. They snuck 19 known members of their group past U.S. immigration, they then taught themselves how to skillfully fly commercial jetliners. They then boarded 4 commercial jet airliners on the same morning, carrying box cutters without attracting any suspicion, and then successfully hijacked the planes, brought down 3 New York City skyscrapers with 2 of the planes, successfully attacked the Pentagon by performing an almost impossible aerial maneuver with the 3rd, and finally made the 4th plane all but disappear without a trace into a field in Pennsylvania. Is that in fact what happened? We should be careful about jumping to conclusions. Perhaps like a good criminal investigator, historians should ask questions like, who could have carried out such a plot? What motive did they have? Does the physical and circumstantial evidence support our conclusions? And perhaps most important, who benefited? Who would have the motive and capability of concealing the truth? The late economist and historian Murray N. Rothbard once remarked, "I'm not interested in conspiracy theories. I'm interested in actual conspiracies." It would be naive of us to simply assume that there are no conspiracies, as it would be paranoid of us to assume that everything is a conspiracy. Still, unexplained inconsistencies, unanswered questions surrounding events like the 1941 attack on Pearl Harbor, the assassination of President Kennedy, and the 9/11 hijackings and attacks await explanation. Decades often pass before evidence is discovered or declassified, or aging witnesses come forward, or someone just connects the dots. Like the perfect crime, successful conspiracies are likely never discovered. The famous Spanish-American philosopher George Santayana once remarked, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." There is some truth in that statement, quoted by almost every history teacher, but no 2 historical events or developments are ever exactly the same. There are numerous examples of people taking Santayana's lesson too far. America's Cold War against the Soviet Union was likely the unfortunate result of political leaders and the general public assuming the Soviet Union was just like Nazi Germany and required the same approach, that is, forceful military confrontation. American policymakers just assumed that the Soviet Union was out to conquer the world and acted accordingly. The U.S. government spent trillions of dollars and likely killed millions of people trying to prevent something that likely never would have happened anyway, that is, Russia conquering the world. Some historians, such as Patrick Buchanan, even begun to question whether even Hitler's Germany had any such ambitions of global conquest. Buchanan's historical research raises almost heretical questions. Could Hitler have been dealt with without resort to armed conflict? Were the Allies, Britain, France, the United States, and the Soviet Union, just as responsible for World War II as were Germany and Japan? For more, see Buchanan's recent book, Churchill, Hitler, and an Unnecessary War. History is never simple, and one must be careful about jumping to conclusions about the causes of this event or that event, or the motivation of historical actors. So history can illuminate as well as mislead. The truth about the past is out there, but it is often elusive. One must continually question what one is reading or being told about the past. One must not only look at the motives of historical actors, but at the motives of the historians telling the story. As the hundreds of millions of people killed by the 20th century communists can attest, a little history can be a dangerous thing. There are people in power that profit immensely by promoting a particular view of the past. As Orwell noted, people's understanding of the past colors their view of the present and influences their actions that create the future.